Welcome to the Optimove podcast, and if you've listened to an episode before, welcome back. In today's episode, Dr. Guild and I talk about strength training in a little more depth than we did last time. This involves topics like the different types of strength training, the different types of hypertrophy. Is it better to use free weights or machines? Are single joint or multi-joint exercises better? Delayed onset muscle soreness, and so much more. We even debunk one of the most popular myths out there about strength training, and that's the myth that lifting light weights is beneficial. Basically, this is the episode for you if you understand the benefits of strength training but don't know how to get started correctly. Dr. Guild offers tremendous advice on that front based on very many years of experience helping all shapes, sizes, and builds of people do exactly that. I hope you enjoy this episode.
All right. Welcome to the Optimove podcast. We're excited to have you all here on today. So we've talked about in the past about strength training and, the one thing to get started, if you will, and a lot of the behavioral aspects around strength training and how to empower people to get started. So today we're going to talk more about more of the what to do to get started. Maybe you want to get started and you're past just getting through the one thing, and you want a more robust approach. You actually want to dive into it. You got access to a gym and you really want to get started with strength training, or maybe you've been strength training for a while and you think there might be a better way to do it. So we'll provide some guidance along the way here as well. So we'll talk a lot about basically how to structure a strength training workout. We'll talk about muscle soreness and why to do strength training in ways that you probably haven't heard about before. So we'll dive into that. And so here with us is our producer, Anmar. He's going to help us facilitate the conversation a little bit, as well as, he's interested in the topic, of course. So he's going to join us today to help us and guide us along as he learns along with us as well. So thank you for being here, Anmar.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. We have some really fun topics lined up here, so I'm excited. I think it's going to be a fun conversation.
Excellent. And some word translation and everything else as we were putting this down. So we'll dial it down and make it consumable for everybody else. So, so my background, I'm a physical therapist. Originally, I was a strength conditioning coach and personal trainer. So working with elite athletes and really being in that world of strength conditioning. So working with elite athletes, doing, Olympic lifts and, working with kettlebells and all that sort of stuff. So that's the world I originally came from. And of course, before that time, it was bodybuilding. I was the meathead in the gym. It's been the evolution. You eventually end up doing for a career and then your calling, if you will, I guess, what your main hobby was. And my main hobby was the weight room. So I've always loved it and still do. So now it's and I think the biggest thing with that is with changing your physical body, I think it's something that you have most control over almost anything else. So obviously your behavior, but also if you change your physical body, then that helps control behavior as well. Because when you can control your physical body, it changes your physiology. So if you're regularly working out, if you're regularly strength training, it's going to change every aspect of your life, including the way you behave, the way you respond to things. And so I think that's why I got into strength training, went to the gym. It could be whatever you like. It could be dancing. It could be yoga. It's whatever form of physical activity that you love to do. And that gives you a sense of power. And it's true of any age. It doesn't matter. And with a lot of our clients, they tend to be older. They tend to be suffering from neurological deficits and things like that. And in that situation, it's still the same thing. It's one thing that people have a lot of control over in their life, to be able to progress it and work on it consistently. So I think that's one of the big whys with strength training or any form of exercise is it puts the power back in your own hands. And Anmar, I think you've experienced that as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we'll get started. So we've talked in the past about, the one thing to get started. Then the example I gave was basically standing up from a chair, and then progressing from that to if you're past standing up from a chair and doing it correctly, lowering yourself down, tapping the chair and standing back up. So that was kind of the one thing that we talked about. And so where to go beyond that if you want to do more. So let's talk about a little bit about kind of an outline, if you will, of strength training. And the problem the good and the challenge that we're seeing in the fitness world is a lot of times people, let's say they've never gone to a gym before, especially people over the age of whatever, they know strength training is important. They want to get started. And they're guided by the fitness staff or whoever it is from machine to machine to machine. And they're basically just walk through each machine. And you'll see this all the time. You'll see older people just going from one machine to the next, to the next, to the next. And it's great. It's a great way to get started. You hit all your muscle groups. You get the strength training in. And oftentimes the fitness professionals are great, and they teach you how to use each machine properly so you don't get hurt. And so you get stronger and you're training the muscles. Now, if you want to take a step beyond that, or if you want to kind of consolidate your strength training into something that is more condensed and focused, that's what we're here to talk about today, how to kind of outline and guide your strength training routine. So does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose we can start with maybe just the different types of strength training that exist. Yeah.
So first off, and you can think about what you've seen in culture and what's around you. So of course, bodybuilders are the first thing oftentimes that people think of when they think of strength training. And what they're doing there, they're basically sculpting. They're sculpting the human body into basically a sculptor, a Michelangelo, if you will. And it's fun to do. It really is. And so I like to call it sculpting rather than bodybuilding because there's figure competitions, there's bodybuilding competitions, and they're graded on symmetry and all these sorts of things. So it truly is an art form. And basically the idea is pumping a bunch of fluid into the muscle in a lot of ways. It's not the most practical or functional thing in the world, but you do get stronger. It's great for the cardiovascular system. If you're not taking additional supplementations and things like that along with it. And so, you get fit, you stay in shape, and it's a great way to look good, and, you work on sculpting. Olympic weightlifting, or just the sport of weightlifting, is what you might see in the Olympics, is, the snatch and the clean and jerk. It's basically popping a lot of weight over your head one time in an explosive fashion. And you'll find that a lot of times those people, they don't look like bodybuilders. Oftentimes they look more normal, like, so to speak. Right. And the reason for that is they're optimizing their nervous system. So they're not focused on the pumping of the fluid into the muscle to make the muscle bigger. Of course, some of that happens, but they mostly, it's getting their nervous system explosive. And we're going to tie this back into the general public, by kind of dividing up into these different parts of strength training. The other one is power training. So squat, deadlift, and bench press. Being able to do a 1 rep max with those 3 lifts, and it's just pure strength, pure force. Squatting from parallel to all the way up. So how much strength do you have in your legs? And so those are the kind of the main different types. So in the general public, what you might see is people do a combination of these things, or they'll do sculpting oftentimes. And so that's when you'll see people breaking their body up into different muscle groups. So they'll do arms one day, legs another day, shoulders another day. And so that's kind of the sculpting type of thing that you'll tend to see in gyms. A great way to get started for health and for the general public is to do basically a full body workout all at once. And we'll talk about today on how to kind of outline that, if that makes sense. So, Anmar, what are you doing lately for your workouts?
So when I started off, it was obviously just picking one exercise, but thankfully the exercise that I picked was actually a compound movement. It was a big kind of bench press type of movement, but with dumbbells. And I started off that way, and that has a lot of benefits. I just think, especially when you're started, especially from a cold start, if you've never lifted before, strengthening one part of your body and without tending to the others is not necessarily meaning one part. It's just when you're using compound movement, it's like you're strengthening not only the muscle that you're targeting or the group of muscle that you're targeting, but everything that supports that. So there's a lot less risk of injury and that type of thing. And so I thought that really worked well. And then as I'm progressing, mostly for vanity, to be honest, but it's like sometimes you start just picking a certain part and just sculpting that way. But it started off with big compound movements, and I continue those big compound movements, but then with the addition of small isolation exercises here and there.
Yeah. And it's an important distinction. So we'll call them, multi-joint motion. So it's exercises or compound movements where it's multiple joints moving at one time. So your bench press, your pull downs, squats and deadlifts and things like that. And the powerful part of these exercises is it works so much of the body at one time. So if you're doing a bench press type of movement, you're working your chest, your shoulders, and your triceps all in once, theoretically, assuming that you're optimizing them as well as possible. But that's another conversation. Compared to, let's say, if you're just doing a bicep curl or just a tricep exercise, you're mainly focused on one exercise or one muscle, and there is some increased risk of single joint motions, or just that bicep curl or that tricep extension, whatever it is, because you're focused on just a small joint and a lot of tendons that are having to deal with a load that they may not be used to, and if they're not warmed up enough, it can be slightly problematic. So just being extra cautious with those single joint motions, so bicep curls and things like that. But yeah, the multi-joint motions tend to be where we tend to start people off. It's the most bang for your buck. And it's also a great way of working into the single joint motions. So you might include the single joint motions, the bicep curls, the tricep exercises later on in the workout, once you're warmed up, once everything's gotten going, no matter what your age is. So it reduces the risk of injury to start with the larger movements first.
Right, absolutely. And I have also a tendency to prefer free weights over machines, and I know that you're the same. So maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So in fact, I could make the argument that fixed motion machines are actually higher risk than free weights, which is kind of contradictory to what most people would believe. And the reason for that is you're kind of fixed into one position. So like you take a bench press type of machine. You're sitting in a chair and you're fixed as far as how you can move the machine, if that makes sense, right? And so then what you'll often see is you don't have much wiggle room for adjustments based on you as an individual. And so the shoulders will hike up, and you have to somehow get the machine into a certain type of position that's safe to start the exercise. But usually these machines are set up in a way where you're starting them out in an unsafe way, if that makes sense. Because so you're starting the bench press machine all the way back where the shoulders are, and you're already in a really stretched out position at the very bottom, which is a very precarious situation for the shoulders. So then on a machine, you start out that way. As opposed to with free weights, you have that freedom, you have that wiggle room. Your body is able to make those adjustments along the way, and you have a lot of freedom to be able to just move according to what your body needs to do.
Right. And what are the odds that a machine that's meant to be used by everyone is set up to work exactly with your height and your arm length and your everything? We just have different measurements. Even people of the same height have completely different arm lengths and things like that. So there's a small degree of adjustability that you have with machines, but not nearly enough.
And even the adjusting the machines can be difficult a lot of times, especially, so then people, it can be very difficult to adjust the machines, and injuries can occur that way as well. So I tend to prefer free weights. My exception to that is upper body pulling motions. And I'll often go to those sorts of machines frequently, and I still do, your pull downs and, cable rows and all these sorts of things. And the reason for that is I don't see the same types of problems with those machines as far as getting started. And you do tend to have a lot of freedom of movement. And the really only other way to do that type of motion is to get your body in a bent over parallel position to the ground, or to do a pull-up type of motion, which those are very advanced movements. And they're very hard to get people in and to get them in well. So to have a machine where you can do more of a rowing motion or a pulling motion is beneficial. So that's where I'll use machines quite a bit more often. And as far as leg machines, the knee extension machine tends to put a lot of pressure on the knee that we don't want. So having exercises where your foot is planted onto the ground, and step ups and squats or sit to stands, deadlifts and things like that are much healthier on the joints than the fixed motion machines oftentimes. So the other big difference between fixed motion machines versus free weights is free weights will teach you actually how to move. And I think that's the biggest benefit of it. With a fixed motion machine, you don't have to become a better mover. In order to squat effectively, in order to do a sit to stand effectively, in order to do all these other things effectively, your body has to learn how to move properly. And sometimes you don't have to consciously do it. It just figures it out on its own. So it's one of the big benefits of free weights. By doing free weights, you optimize your body's own movement, and then you carry that over into everyday life. And so then overall, you move more easily and your basic movements improve, and then you reduce the risk of injuries that way. Certainly. If that makes sense. So we've touched on basically the benefits of multi-joint motions or compound motions, and then free weights versus machines. So we'll talk about a little bit of outlining.
Yeah, so let's go a little bit backwards here. We skip past, let's say, like different types of hypertrophy when we're talking about different types of strength training. So not all strength training is equal. And so maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So let's go back to the bodybuilders, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So their focus, like I said, is pumping fluid into the muscle. Right. And so contrary to what most people think, most of those workouts are spent doing actually higher repetition in low weight in a lot of ways, especially towards the end of the workout when you're just lifting. You'll see bodybuilders sometimes they'll be bicep curling, like a 10-pound dumbbell, and it's some huge guy and he's just really struggling. You're like wondering what's going on. It's towards the end of his workout and he's going till failure, and that's what that is. So that type of hypertrophy it's called a sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. So big fancy word for you're pumping fluid into the muscle and the wall of the muscle is increasing and it gets bigger. And that's why you see that sculpting type of look on bodybuilders and figure competitors and people doing these types of exercises, breaking their body up into different muscle groups and doing several exercises for the same muscle in one workout. They're pumping fluid into the muscle, doing 8 to 15 repetitions generally. And then, maybe going higher. Of course, they'll have times where they go really heavy, but in less reps. But the overall idea is higher reps and pumping fluid into the muscle. Now, if you want to focus more on your muscles being optimal for, let's say, standing up from a chair or just being strong, being powerful, being able to deal with everyday life, then you're looking at myofibral hypertrophy. And that's basically where you're working on the contractile units within the muscle itself. So our muscles, of course, have the muscle wall inside the cell, but then within them, you actually have the pulleys, the levers, if you will, to put it simply, that make those contractions happen. And those functional practical units become stronger or become bigger with that type of hypertrophy. And so where you'll see that is your Olympic weightlifters and power lifters, and even very specifically the Olympic weightlifters. And they're training that myofibral hypertrophy the most, and they're working on training their nervous system the most to make them powerful and explosive. Tie back to the general public for everyday health, the most optimal thing to focus on would be that myofibral hypertrophy. So not so much pumping the fluid to the muscle and making it bigger, but working on the contractile units within the muscle. So if you're doing a sit to stand or a squat, that's where the focus on standing up from the chair fast. That's when you're going to get the most bang for your buck, if that's the goal, to be able to respond well when you lose your balance and still be able to respond well enough so that you don't fall. And that's a problem we often see. So people don't respond as well as they used to as they get older. And so by training that type of in that type of fashion and focused on the functionality and the contractile units within the muscle, you become more powerful, more explosive, and it allows you to deal with the dynamics of life better.
Certainly. And there are two kind of studies that I want to bring up here, that the first of which is about rep ranges. And there's a lot of debate within the fitness community about which rep ranges work best. A lot of people kind of are in the camp of lifting very heavy weights at low reps. And then a lot of people say lifting very lighter weights at heavier reps. And really, this study found that the key is firstly training enough to where you can barely get the last rep in. So training close to failure. And the only thing is that I've had a lot of trouble gaining muscle or gaining size with high repetitions, but I was doing it incorrectly. And then I figured out it was because a lot of people have trouble, especially when they start to get tired towards the end of a workout, with pushing enough weight, really. And so if you really increase the weight to where you're really going up against your endurance as well, but you're lifting heavy enough to where that end of that higher rep range is really getting you close towards failure. You can see incredible results from that. The second study was kind of a meta-analysis of all of these studies that were kind of done about the rep ranges. And what it found is, truthfully, the biggest the biggest kind of factor in whether or not, the biggest determinant in whether or not you can increase muscle size is the variance of the rep ranges too. Our bodies are just incredible at adapting to things. And so if we spend all of our time in one rep range, we'll get used to it and it stops being as effective as switching to another. And so I think that's the key too, is just varying it every so often.
Yeah, it's, that's why you'll have that range, right? So, for bodybuilders, let's say, going between 8 to 15s, for instance, or sometimes going down to 6, but they're not going to stay there very long. They're going to work back up, but they'll drop back down to, as the fitness community say, to trick the muscle, but you're stimulating it. It needs different stimulation over a period of time. And that's important as well. So you're not always doing, 10 repetitions for 6 months. You're increasing the repetition and then you'll drop it back down. So let's say you'll spend like 3 or 4 weeks at 10 repetitions, and then after 3 or 4 weeks, you move it up to 12 repetitions at the same weight. And then another 3 or 4 weeks, move it to 13 or 14 repetitions. And then eventually you might drop it back down to 6 or 8. And a lot of times you'll hear 6 or 8 repetitions, 8 or 10 repetitions, right? To 12. It's a good rep range to get started. So 8 to 12 repetitions, if you're just getting started, is a good repetition to work on strength, and also in a way that is not going to increase risk of injury. So if you're just getting started, generating a lot of force and getting stronger is very important. So, but 3 repetitions, if you're just getting started, would not be a good way to go, because the load is too heavy and it's increased risk of injury. By the time you're dropping that low in reps and adding the necessary weight there, it needs to be a focus. You need to have that base. So spending time in that 8 to 12 rep range is a great way to get started. So multi-joint motions, 8 to 12 repetitions, great way to get started. We do need to vary up the repetitions in order to stimulate the muscle as we go. And then focusing on basically, add some power to it. So when you're standing up from a chair, or when you're doing squats or you're doing step ups, go up fast, if you will, as opposed to just going through the motions, and that can help as well.
Yeah. So in a way as well that relates, I suppose, to the general public, we can talk about fast twitch muscle fibers and the effect that age has on that.
Yeah, and so fast twitch versus slow twitch. So basically our nervous system determines what the muscle optimizes for. And that's determined basically by the nervous system to, by basically a nerve called a motor unit that goes to all the different muscles. So basically the main takeaway here is determined by the nervous system. It's not determined by the muscle. The muscle then forms itself around what the nerve tells it to do. And so that's why when you'll hear us talking about you're training the nervous system, that's one aspect of that. So fast twitch is basically on the extreme of, to put very simply, and there's plenty of variability in between this, but we'll keep it simple. Basically, fast twitch is for explosive and maximum force. So lifting a large amount of weight and doing it fast and powerfully. That's what fast twitch muscles are for. Slow twitch are built for endurance. They're meant to go for a long period of time, sustain whatever you're doing for a long period of time. Your marathon runners are generally a lot more slow twitch. What determines how much we have is basically based on mostly genetics. Now you can train to move towards one or the other, but only to a certain extent. And so that's why if you take a marathon runner, never in a million years, if they're trained to do that and they have a lot of slow twitch muscle fibers in their legs, they're not going to become a linebacker. So it's genetically predetermined. But you can take that marathon runner and then you can make them more explosive by training them. in a certain way.
And similarly, it's very hard to take a linebacker and have them run for large distances without fatigue, really. And they can train towards that, but not quite as much as someone who has a different build. And
Right. It's much harder. And if you're trying to train for something that you're not specifically built for. However, if you are someone who's more fast twitch, you're with training, you're more likely to be able to get to that endurance, if that makes sense. Whereas if you're slow twitch, it's much more of a brick wall to get to that explosive. But you can go from fast twitch to slow twitch and be a great endurance athlete with training. It'll just take longer.
Interesting. So the endurance is a lot more trainable than the explosiveness.
Yes. So if you're an explosive person, with time you can train towards endurance,
right?
Not so much the other way around. And so if you want to train towards that endurance and you're a very powerful person, and actually those powerful athletes then have an advantage then as they become distance athletes, because what makes the difference between one distance athlete and another is not how much their VO2 max is or the cardiovascular conditioning in of itself, because we can only get so good at that as humans. It's how much power do they have in their legs, and all these other details as well. But leg power makes a big difference, especially in endurance athletes as well. So it's not something to be missed if you're a triathlete or a marathon runner, if you're trained for endurance and focusing on power as a big part of your training. And often sometimes missed in that community, but I think that's changing as well. It used to be the focus was just all on endurance for endurance athletes, but these days we know better. So train for power for endurance athletes as well. For the general public, it's the same concept. And I think getting a good mix is important. So let's go back to to aging, right? So even with elite power athletes, as they get older, they're going to have a decline in their fast twitch muscle fibers. The fast twitch, in general, the fast twitch goes away faster than the slow twitch as people age. And this is a particular problem because it ties in with our ability to react to life. So when we when we lose our balance, for instance, an important aspect of that is having enough of our fast twitch muscle fibers or our fast twitch aspect of our nervous system to be able to respond quickly. And that tends to decline with age. And so it's a huge problem. And this is true even for elite power athletes. As they get older, their power declines no matter how they train. Now, their decline is much slower and much more gradual compared to the general public. In the general public, it drops in comparison. But if you're training for it, you can significantly slow that decline of your ability to generate power, which is very, very important. And so again, it's the ability to respond quickly when you lose your balance and respond powerfully. So power is the way that we engage with our life dynamically. It's the way we can pop up from a chair. It's the way we can climb stairs. It's very, very, very important to be able to do that.
What can you give us the sort of 80-20, the most important parts of this principle? Let's say somebody is thinking that they're getting up there in years and they're going to start losing some of that fast twitch muscle fiber. What are some of the most impactful things they can get started in doing to negate that as much as possible?
Yeah. So the first step would be start strength training in general. So start with the one thing, get started. So doing the sit to stands from the chair, preferably with the chair up against a wall or some stable surface, so you're not worried about the chair moving backwards. And so it's nice and safe. So standing up from a chair or doing chair squats or things like this. Once you get that motion down, and you're doing it consistently, and the other key is consistency, always consistency. The second part is just standing up from that chair fast. And that does a couple things. One, you're optimizing your nervous system, you're optimizing for power, and you're also back to the type of hypertrophy that we talked about before. You're working on the contractile units within the muscle itself, as opposed to just pumping the fluid into the muscle.
So we're not looking for size here. We're looking for strength, functional strength.
Correct. And you'll get a little bit of both, especially in the general public as they get started. Then you'll notice more definition in your muscle no matter what you're doing. But as far as when we get down to the details, that type of power training, standing up fast from the chair, it's going to really emphasize the functional contractile units within the muscle itself. And so you're really optimizing for basically everyday life, if that makes sense.
Certainly. Yeah. And when you say the one thing, that's referring to our previous episode where we talked about the important principle that if somebody is looking to get started and they have trouble with committing, they have trouble to committing to exercise, or doing any sort of habit repeatedly, a really great way to get started is just pick one exercise that's easy to do and just kind of do it over and over until that starts to become easy, and then you can ramp up from there.
Absolutely. And it's the majority of this is behavior. And again, the key to becoming stronger, more powerful, is consistency, and behavior, and just and doing it. It's executing on it, implementing it. And the strength training can come from many different forms. So if you love Pilates or yoga, there's ways of incorporating strength into those as well. And any part of those that you're missing, you can always do a little bit in the weight room, in addition to what you're already doing. Or say you love dance or whatever you love doing. There's always ways of incorporating strength training into other areas. And the other important part about this is doing what you really love to do. And I'm open about the idea that I'm not a big yoga person, even though I see the value in it, right? I just don't like the way it feels on my body. I enjoy the weight room. I enjoy the strength training. But
you advocate yoga for a lot of other people.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because the flexibility part of it is so important. Yeah. And what yoga allows people to do for flexibility and the mobility of their joints is so powerful. And a lot of people gravitate to more that type of exercise. And if you enjoy that, then do that. And then you find a way to incorporate strength and power training in addition to the yoga or Pilates or whatever that you're doing, or Zumba, or whatever type of exercise that you like. And so then I'll incorporate stretching into the weight room on a regular basis. And I think that's the other powerful part of strength training, is back to the point where if you're focused on, it trains you to move better, right? Especially free weights. So if you're doing free weights on a regular basis, your body's going to learn how to move better, just naturally as you go. And it doesn't make you more tight. It does in some ways, but that can be mitigated. And then oftentimes what you have to do is, in order to do this exercise well, I have to do this stretch in order to do this well. So the way I incorporate my stretching in my life is, the more I go into the weight room, the more I stretch. Because in order to do bench press sufficiently, I have to stretch my chest. I have to stretch my shoulders. In order to do a push press or military press, to lift weight over my head, I have to have enough motion in my shoulders in order to do that. So before I even try that lift, I do a lot of stretching on my shoulders beforehand so that I have enough motion. And so all these different forms of exercise are important, and it's about what you enjoy doing, what your body gravitates well towards. And then you can add in the details. If you're a weight room person, you can add in the flexibility on top of that. If you're not a weight room person, there's ways to add strength and power training in. So it's also about what you enjoy doing and what you'll be able to get your body to do.
Yeah. And if I can add this detail, if none of these physical type of activities seem enjoyable to you, I wouldn't let that deter you, because a lot of times, if you can start off with just that one exercise and you can learn to enjoy it. And a lot of times, maybe the thing that prevents you from enjoying the thing is how difficult it seems. But then ultimately, when you start doing it and getting better at it, that progress will motivate. I mean, that was certainly the case for me. I mean, there was nothing less interesting to me than the weight room. It just seemed like a massive commitment. It seemed like it was hard to do, but then when you start off with one exercise and all of a sudden you're starting to see progress, that turns the weight room from an unnecessary part of culture that I just walk by every day and never even look at, into something that I can't walk by without entering every single time. And, so I wouldn't discount the fact that a lot of times we just have kind of casual contempt for things that we think are difficult, and we never really investigate that. But if you just get started, if you just get started on that one thing and make a little bit of progress, you'd be surprised at how your preferences change. So I wouldn't let that deter you completely, but certainly I think overall in this principle, it's like consistency is the most important part. So if you cannot find that thing, or if you cannot develop that passion into something that will let you do it over and over, that's not going to work out. It's not something where you can kind of put a bunch of credits in by doing a workout one day and then rest for the rest of the month. That's not exactly how it works. That's not really beneficial to your body, and it's not going to give you the results that you want.
Yeah. Now you'll meet those people on occasion where, why do you walk? You'll see them at the gym or their strength training, and whatever. You'll ask them, why are you walking every day, or what brings you here every day? What motivates you? And they will say, well, my doctor told me to do it, so I'm doing it. And then they begrudgingly come in and they do it. And that works with some people, but probably not a large number of people. And so it's starting with, once you kind of get started, you might learn to enjoy it, or it's finding the right way to enjoy it and building from there. So, but once you get started, it's like, what to do to get started, right? Mm-hmm. So we talked about the sit to stands from the chair. It's a very safe, basic way to get going. So how you might outline a workout routine. And this is important, and it will help you probably cut down on a lot of time. So if you are one of those people who's going from machine to machine to machine, or just kind of doing random things in the weight room without really knowing what to do, there's plenty of information out there, and probably even too much information out there. And so that can be a barrier as well. So simple way to look at it. So general warm up. So basically increase your body temperature, spend at least 3, if not 5 minutes, somehow increasing your body temperature on a bike, on a treadmill, whatever's safe and effective for you. The older you are, the more you should spend time doing that general warm up and increasing body temperature. We're just not as pliable as we used to be when we're younger. And so the older you are, spend more time just warming up. That's going to help decrease risk of injuries. After that, if you need to do any type of specific exercises to improve your motion. So let's say if you know that you're going to be pushing weight overhead, or you know that you're going to be doing bench press type of exercises, or one key thing with squats is ankle mobility. So the ability to move the ankles well is a huge component of squatting well, or sit to stands from a chair well. So stretching any type of anything that needs to be stretched or moved before doing the strength training. So
those are 3 very common exercises. Let's call it a bench press, an overhead press, and a squat. What are some stretches that we can get started with on those?
So a bench press, so stretching out your chest, you'll see people stretching on the foam roller, let's say, and then putting their arms out to the side. You can do it up against a wall, simple doorway. You can probably find a few YouTube videos on that to simply stretch the chest, but be very careful with that one. And then basically, so bench press.
So overhead press then?
Overhead press, similar. Oh, that's a whole nother conversation for another day. But I think the main takeaway here is the stretching a little bit before, if the emphasis is on improving the motion that you're working on. Now, for the long term, and the controversy of when to stretch, right? Do I stretch before the workout or after? And so my answer is always, so if you're stretching to improve the movement during the workout, then stretch before. Now, if the emphasis is on just kind of long-term flexibility, then do it after, if that makes sense. And what you'll actually find is when you stretch beforehand and then you go do the strength training, you're actually able to lift heavier and better if you improve your motion beforehand. So you got the general warm-up, increasing body temperature, doing a little bit of stretching beforehand, specific to whatever you're doing. And then from there, you can think of it as a single leg movement. So for instance, a step up, a lunge, a lateral squat, anything where you're doing one leg individually. And so a step up is a perfect example of that. Very simple to do. You can hold on to a railing, if that's the way you need to get started, that's perfectly fine. You can do that in the comfort of your own home, on the stairs. And, the reason for this is each leg needs to work individually. And if you do just all what we call double leg movements, so let's say squats and deadlifts and things like that, then you run the risk of one leg always working to do the movement compared to the other. And you'll even get the hip shifting in a weird way and everything else if you do this over a period of time. This happened to me in the past. If you do too much of just, double leg movements where you're symmetrical, squats and deadlifts and all these things, you can become asymmetrical very fast, if that makes sense. So incorporating single leg movements in is very important. So step ups and lunges and things like that. And so that's the power of single leg movements. From there, if you're doing full body, then just go back and forth between that and either an upper body pushing motion or an upper body pulling motion. So your pushing motions are your bench presses, your push press, your military press. They're exercises that mainly work the chest and the shoulders, and you're pressing away from the body, and the triceps. It's the muscle groups where you're pressing away from the body. Whereas your pulling motions are the motions that are working mainly your upper back and the muscles that flex your elbow. So let's say mainly your bicep and other muscles. And so, but both are very important. I'd say in a lot of ways, the pulling motion is more important because it's what helps pull us back into a better posture. And so we want to, if in doubt, incorporate more pulling motions than pushing motions. So back to the outline, if you will, single leg motion, superset that. And when I say superset, I mean going back and forth between one and the other. So you do a set of step ups, and then you do a set of, let's say bench press, and then you alternate back and forth between the two. However many sets you do, 2 sets, 4 sets, whatever it might be, do that together, and then go to the next superset. So in this case, a double leg movement. So let's say a squat, a sit to stand, a deadlift, and then superset that with another upper body pushing or pulling motion. So, and it doesn't matter which one you start with, I would say. You can argue for one versus the other, but it really doesn't matter. So that type of outline will help kind of simplify things, if that makes sense. And you'll be able to work the whole body with that type of an outline. And then after that, core work, and then stretching from there. And if you want to incorporate your single joint motions, your bicep curls, your tricep, I would say the most practical for everyday life to prevent injury as far as single joint motions, reverse curls. And what that is, it's where you're basically doing a bicep curl except with the palm down. Reason for that is it works the opposite muscles of the muscles that flex the elbow. And we're always flexing our elbow. We're always carrying things. We're always at our computer. And what these muscles do, they help prevent overuse injury of the muscles that flex the elbow. So prevent carpal tunnel and all sorts of injuries. So bicep tendonitis and all these problems that people tend to have. So by doing a bicep curl with the palm down, that is much better from a health perspective than a bicep curl itself, or moving more towards the reverse curl. So basically you're working the forearm muscles, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, there are endless rabbit holes that we can go down, as is obvious here, and it's such an exciting topic. But I think let's kind of quickly hit on these, just to make sure not to miss the last few topics. We're actually going to talk about the different types of contractions, eccentric versus concentric, DOMs, and then finally we're going to debunk a very commonly held myth. So let's kind of work through those. Yeah.
So there's very important to understand when people are sitting down. We've all seen, let's say, older people when they go to sit down, but they just kind of plop into the chair.
Right. It's not very controlled.
It's not controlled. So there's basically 2 parts of the lifting, if you will. So if you're doing a bicep curl, you're bending your elbow. You have the shortening of the muscle on the way up. And so that's important because that's usually what we think of when we're lifting weights and contracting our muscles. But the most important part from a real life perspective is that part where you're actually lowering the arm down. And that's the part that's missed when people are sitting into a chair and they don't have control. It's that lowering contraction on the way down. We call it the eccentric contraction. And so if you're doing your sit to stands or squats, it's the part where you're lowering down slowly on the way down, whether you have to reach back with your arms, whether you're just going to tap the chair and go back up. It's that lowering contraction on the way down. It's also what allows you to decelerate correctly and have control when you're decelerating, if that makes sense, which is very important. Hip strengthening, which we've talked about in previous episodes. It's not just the lifting the leg up to the side. It's also the lowering the leg down back towards you. That's also important. because you need to be able to have that eccentric control. It's a different type of contraction. So you can have one and miss out on the other. If you're always emphasizing the shortening, let's say the standing up from the chair, but then don't focus on the lowering back down. And I think that's the biggest takeaway for the general public. It's also the focusing on the lower back down. Tying it back to what we call delayed onset muscle soreness. This is really important because it's something that is misunderstood, I think, quite a bit in the general public. So muscle soreness is an important part of strength training for everybody, minus just a couple of diagnoses. But 99.9% of people, that muscle soreness is a good thing. And when we tend to expect it, it tends to be 12 to 72 hours afterwards. So it tends to be delayed, and it tends to, and you'll be sore and you can feel stiff, and that's normal. And to know whether it's a good type of soreness versus a not good type of soreness, usually it will be on both sides of the body if it's good. And it'll also be more of an achy type of feeling. Now, if you're older, and if it debilitates the way you move and you can't move around very well, then it might be too much soreness, if that makes sense. And so it just depends on how much risk and aggressive you want to be with it. For if you're in high school, I've had times where after strength training, my leg would just give out all of a sudden because I worked it so hard.
You'd have to kind of sit there in the car for a couple of minutes before you can drive home. Just let it hang out. Yeah.
But it's the amount of risk that you're willing to take. So you might be able to take more risk as a younger person, like work yourself to feel really sore, or like you judge your group exercise instructor on how sore they made your muscles, right? It's that type of thing. But if you're trained just to be healthier and to move better, the objective might not be to, rock your muscles and get them real sore. So then you'll expect some level of soreness. 12 to 72 hours afterwards is appropriate. Beyond 72 hours, or 4 days. If it's the fifth day and you're still sore from a workout, you've overdone it. Yeah. Achy on the same side. And it gets better. The second day tends to be the worst for most people. We expect that. And then usually around day 3, it starts getting better and better and better. And so this is normal, and it's actually an essential part of the strength training process. And it's that lowering contraction, let's say into the chair. So if you're doing the sit to stands, and then you're lowering yourself down as you go down to the chair, it's that lowering contraction that creates the most muscle soreness. And so it's a very essential part of strength training, and an important part of how we move.
Right, certainly, because a lot of us just rely on gravity. It's very easy to let gravity just kind of pull you into that chair and not control it. And so it makes sense that would be a little bit less worked than the muscles we use to get up against gravity. Yeah. Well, finally, there's a big myth going around that lifting light weights is beneficial in any way.
Right.
Tell us about that.
Yeah. So we'll run to people all the time and say, oh yeah, I lift weights, and I stay real light, and they'll have like 3-pound dumbbells in their hands or whatever it might be, and they're doing exercise where clearly they could be lifting heavier. Done safely, and you can start out light, and you want to get the motion, you want to expose your body to the resistance training. The objective should be to increase that resistance. Very important. People, especially older people, the benefit of lifting heavier and being able to be strong, be powerful, lift a lot of force, and for bone density as well. Like that is very healthy, say for an older person to be able to, let's say, stand up from a chair, again, being safe, but if they're able to hold a weight underneath them, or even up at their chest, if they can do that without pain and they can do that safely, increasing weight is actually a good thing in most situations. Now, talk to your doctor, before getting to that extent, because there can be certain situations with you where that may not be safe. But in general, as we get older, it's actually more important that we're becoming stronger, and we should be focusing on safely and gradually lifting heavier and in a more powerful way. It's good for our bones. It's good for our ability to react with life, to be more dynamic. It's not going to make us bulky. You're not going to make yourself bulky. A lot of work and a lot of times additional supplementation has to be put into to get people bulky. So it's better to be stronger and it's better to be powerful, no matter your age.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap it. I think some of the biggest takeaways for me, at least, were don't be afraid of free weights. Don't be afraid of heavy weights. And, for the most part, I mean, compound lifts are just kind of multi-joint exercises are very beneficial, and just stay within that rep range of, what's the overall kind of recommendation for the rep range people should stay at in most cases?
Yeah. 8 to 12 or 8 to 15 is
That's a pretty safe one. You can't really go wrong anywhere there. So awesome. Well, I think this is hugely in the weeds, but a massively beneficial episode. So thank you very much for all this information.
Awesome. Thank you, Anmar.
Hey, everybody. This is the producer, Anmar here. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review. If you want to subscribe to the Optimove podcast, head to www.podcast.optimovedfw.com. That's where you'll find links to subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Once again, that's www.podcast.optimovedfw.com. To learn more about Optimove, our practice, go to www.optimovedfw.com. And lastly, if you're in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, give us a call at 214-712-8242. That's 214-712-8242. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.